The room was already laughing when she felt it turn toward her. Polished shoes gleamed under the lights, medals caught gold fire on pressed chests, and the long table smelled faintly of coffee, starch, and old wood soaked in decades of authority. The general's smile was loose, careless, the kind worn by men who had never been questioned in rooms like this. He leaned back, eyes skimming the officers, and when they landed on her, the air subtly shifted. He asked it lightly, like a party trick, like a harmless joke meant to break the stiffness. How many had she killed? Silence followed, thick and wrong. She did not flinch. She felt the weight of eyes, the history in those walls, the quiet expectation that she would smile, deflect, make it easier for everyone else. Her hands rested on the table, steady, nails clean, skin scarred so faintly most never noticed. Inside her, memory stirred, not loudly, not violently, but with the calm persistence of a tide that never forgets the shore. She had learned long ago that war did not announce itself with numbers. It came as heat against the face, as dust in the mouth, as a copper taste that never fully washed away. It came as the pressure of a rifle against the shoulder, as breath counted and recounted, until it no longer felt like breathing at all. She had been young when she first understood that survival carried a cost that did not show up on commendations. Every decision pressed into her spine, layered itself into her sleep. She had carried Marines out of smoke, so thick it seemed solid, had watched boys try to be men in moments that crushed both. The room before her knew none of that. They saw only rank, uniform, and the novelty of a woman who did not fit their expectations. The general chuckled again, filling the pause, giving her an escape she did not take. Around them, Navy officers shifted, some uncomfortable, some amused, some already turning away, certain they knew how this would end. She felt no anger rise, only a deep, controlled stillness. She thought of names she never spoke aloud. She thought of hands that had gone cold in hers. She thought of the first time she realized that killing was never a tally, but a fracture that ran through time. When she finally spoke, her voice was level, almost gentle, and it carried farther than shouting ever could. She said she did not count enemies. She said she counted the Marines who came home because she stood where she stood. The room stilled again, but this time it was not awkward. It was reverent, though many did not yet understand why. She went on, not louder, not softer, but truer. She counted the nights she stayed awake so others could sleep. She counted the times she chose hesitation over glory, restraint over revenge. She counted the lives she refused to take, because she had learned how heavy even one could be. The general's smile faltered, not in embarrassment yet, but in confusion, as if the rules of the exchange had quietly changed without his permission. Her words did not accuse, yet accusation bloomed in every listener. She spoke of war as something that lived on long after gunfire ended, something that settled into marriages, into empty chairs, into birthdays celebrated with absence. She spoke of the cost that followed her home, the silence that sometimes screamed louder than explosions. The Navy officers, men hardened by steel and salt, felt something tighten behind their ribs. They had heard bravado before. They had heard numbers thrown like trophies. They had not expected this. The general tried to laugh it off again, but the sound died quickly. He cleared his throat, straightened, suddenly aware of the room watching him now. She did not look at him with defiance. She looked past him, as if seeing something far away, something only she could see. In her mind, a desert dawn stretched pale and unforgiving. A convoy moved slowly, every shadow a question. She remembered the moment she chose mercy when protocol allowed otherwise, the moment that decision saved a family she never met. She remembered the opposite moments too, the ones that could never be undone. Those memories did not haunt her because she had faced them, honored them, carried them without pretending they were lighter than they were. Around the table, respect replaced amusement in quiet increments. A captain lowered his gaze. An admiral folded his hands, thoughtful. The injustice of the joke revealed itself not through outrage but through shame, shared and heavy. The general finally nodded, a small, stiff movement, and murmured something that sounded like thanks, but felt more like retreat. She accepted it without satisfaction. This was never about winning. It was about truth refusing to bend. Later, when the room emptied and the laughter did not return, her words lingered like a pressure change before a storm. They would be repeated in hallways, misquoted, argued over. Some would dismiss them as theatrics. Others would carry them quietly, letting them work inward. She left without ceremony, her steps unhurried, the familiar ache in her joints reminding her of years, measured not in jokes, but in choices. Outside the air was cooler, the sky wide and indifferent. She breathed deeply, grounding herself in the present, in the simple fact of being alive. She did not think of herself as extraordinary. She thought of herself as accountable. War had taught her that the loudest truths were often spoken calmly, that dignity did not need permission. The general would forget the joke eventually. The Navy would remember the moment, even if they could not articulate why. And somewhere between memory and silence, her answer would remain not as a rebuke, but as a reminder that some questions reveal more about the one who asks than the one who answers. The silence she left behind followed her down the corridor, stretching, clinging, refusing to dissolve. Even after the doors closed and the room returned to its polished murmurs, the weight of her words remained suspended, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She walked past framed photographs of past commands, faces frozen in black, and, white certainty, men immortalized in moments where doubt had been edited out. Her reflection slid across the glass as she passed, older than most of those faces, steadier, marked by things no portrait ever captured. She had not intended to expose anything. Truth had simply reached the surface the way it always did with her, slow, inevitable, unstoppable. She felt it now in the subtle tightening of her chest, in the faint tremor that came only after the danger had passed. Confrontation never frightened her. What unsettled her was memory, because memory carried faces instead of abstractions. She remembered a young Marine crouched behind a burned-out vehicle, hands shaking so badly he could barely reload. She remembered the smell of scorched rubber and something sweeter underneath, a smell she learned never to identify aloud. She remembered choosing where to stand so others would not have to. Behind closed doors, the room she had left began to fracture into private reckonings. A rear admiral sat staring at his untouched cup, thinking of a deployment long ago when he had counted days like victories and bodies like proof. A commander replayed the general's tone in his head and felt an unfamiliar discomfort, not because of offense taken, but because of something recognized. Even the general himself remained seated longer than he meant to, fingers resting against the table where her hands had been. He told himself it was harmless humor, that intent mattered more than impact, but the justification felt thin, like armor cracked by a single precise strike. She stepped outside into open air and let it press against her skin. The world here was orderly, predictable, nothing like the places that had trained her senses to hunt for threat in stillness. She slowed her breathing, counting not to calm herself, but to anchor herself. The past had a way of rushing in when it sensed vulnerability. It brought with it the night she first understood that command meant isolation. She had stood alone then too, younger, less certain, responsible for lives that trusted her without fully knowing her. The choice she made that night had saved most of them. The one it hadn't saved still visited her dreams, never accusing, only present. Her reputation had always unsettled people. They called her precise, disciplined, controlled. Few understood that control was not coldness but containment. Without it, everything would spill out at once: the grief, the gratitude, the unbearable clarity of what violence really demanded. She had watched others cope with humor, with bravado, with numbers spoken like currency. She had chosen a different burden, remembering fully, carrying silently. That choice had cost her friendships, promotions, ease. It had also given her something unshakable. As she crossed the courtyard, footsteps approached, hesitant, then firm. A junior officer slowed beside her, clearly wrestling with whether to speak. When he finally did, his voice was careful, almost reverent. He thanked her not loudly, not publicly, but as one human acknowledging another. She nodded once, accepting it without ceremony. Gratitude made her uneasy when it focused on her instead of those who never made it home. Still, she recognized the courage it took to speak at all. Word traveled quickly, as it always did in closed institutions. By evening, her response had already been reshaped, condensed, stripped of its quiet power by repetition. Some framed it as defiance, others as eloquence. A few dismissed it as unnecessary sensitivity. None of those interpretations touched the truth. The truth lived in the moment itself, in the stillness that had followed her words, in the way authority had briefly lost its certainty. That night, alone in her quarters, she removed her uniform with the same care she applied to everything else. Each fold was deliberate, each movement grounded. In the mirror, she studied her own eyes, searching not for pride or regret, but for balance. She saw fatigue there, yes, and something harder to name, resolve sharpened by years of restraint. She did not replay the general's face. She replayed the silence afterward, the rare kind that signaled something had shifted, however slightly. Sleep came slowly. When it did, it carried her back to a different silence, one broken by distant fire and whispered commands. She woke before dawn, heart steady, mind clear. The day ahead would bring consequences. She knew that. Truth always did, but as she dressed she felt no fear. Some lines once drawn could not be erased, and some answers once spoken refused to be reduced to jokes again. Morning arrived without ceremony, pale light sliding across the base, as if nothing of consequence had happened. Yet beneath the routines and salutes, something subtle had shifted. She sensed it in the way eyes lingered a second longer, in the conversations that stopped when she passed and resumed only after careful recalibration. Institutions resisted change by pretending nothing had changed at all. She had seen it before, watched it harden around inconvenient truths like scar tissue. A request reached her before noon, formal and brief, asking her to attend a closed session later that day. No explanation accompanied it, but none was needed. She understood how authority responded when publicly unsettled, first with silence, then with containment. She accepted without comment, neither bracing nor preparing arguments. What needed to be said had already been said. Everything else would be reaction. The room they chose was smaller, stripped of spectacle. No long table, no audience. Just a handful of senior officers and the same general, seated more stiffly now, posture adjusted as if rank itself required reinforcement. The air felt different here, less performative, more cautious. She took her seat and waited, her expression neutral, her presence unyielding without aggression. She had learned, long ago, that stillness could be more disarming than confrontation. They spoke first, carefully. The general referenced tradition, camaraderie, the culture of resilience built on shared hardship and dark humor. He said intent mattered. He said no harm had been meant. Others nodded, contributing phrases about morale, unity, misunderstanding. She listened without interruption, absorbing not just the words but the unease beneath them. These were not cruel men. They were men accustomed to being unchallenged. When it was her turn, she did not argue, she did not correct. She simply spoke of impact, of the space between laughter and memory, of how easily experience could be reduced when treated as spectacle. She described how jokes traveled differently depending on who carried them, how authority amplified some voices while shrinking others. She spoke of the young Marines who would hear that exchange secondhand and learn what was valued, what was trivialized. Her voice remained even, but the room felt heavier with every sentence. The general shifted. Something in her tone had reached past protocol and into personal terrain. He looked at her more directly now, not as a novelty or a challenge, but as a peer whose experience could not be waved aside. He admitted, finally, that he had never thought about it that way. The admission was small, imperfect, but real. Around him, the others fell quiet, recognizing the rare moment when authority bent instead of breaking. The session ended without resolution, no formal apology issued, no statement prepared. That, too, was familiar. Institutions preferred ambiguity to accountability. Still, as she stood to leave, one of the admirals thanked her for her candor. Another asked a question, not about numbers, but about leadership under pressure. The shift was subtle, but it mattered. Outside, the day had warmed. She walked slowly, feeling the sun on her face, the ground solid beneath her boots. She thought of how often change announced itself not with declarations but with discomfort. The general would reflect on the exchange, perhaps defensively at first, perhaps resentfully. Or perhaps, late one night, he would remember her words without the armor of rank and hear them differently. By afternoon, rumors had evolved into debates. Some accused her of overstepping. Others defended her quietly. A few senior enlisted leaders spoke her words back to her, thanking her for saying what they could not. She accepted those moments with the same restraint she brought to everything else. Validation was not the goal. Accuracy was. As evening approached, she found herself at the edge of the base, watching the horizon soften. The sea beyond was calm, deceptively so. She understood that what she had done might cost her. Promotions stalled for lesser reasons. Invitations dried up, but she also understood something else. Silence had a cost too, one she had paid for years. This time, the weight had shifted. She stood there until the light faded, feeling neither triumphant nor defeated. Only resolved, whatever followed would follow. Some truths, once placed in the open, refused to retreat. And even if the institution absorbed the impact without visible change, individuals would carry it forward in quieter ways. That, she knew, was often how the most enduring shifts began. The days that followed settled into an uneasy normal, the kind that pretended equilibrium while quietly recalibrating its center. Officially, nothing had happened. There were no memos, no public acknowledgments, no corrections issued from polished podiums. Unofficially, the air had changed. It showed in the questions asked during briefings, in the jokes that stopped halfway formed, in the way senior leaders chose their words with new care. Change did not arrive loudly. It seeped. She continued her duties with the same discipline she always had, refusing to let the moment define her more than her work already did. Yet, she felt its echo in unexpected places. A lieutenant lingered after a training review, asking how she handled responsibility when every option carried loss. A chief quietly admitted that her answer had stayed with him longer than any speech he had heard in years. These conversations did not make headlines, they mattered more. The general avoided her for a time, not out of hostility, but out of something closer to self-examination. When they finally crossed paths again, weeks later, it was in a hallway stripped of ceremony. He stopped, hesitated, then nodded with a sincerity that had been absent before. He told her he had been thinking about what she said. He did not apologize outright. He did not need to. The acknowledgment carried weight because it was earned. That night, alone again, she allowed herself a rare indulgence, reflection without armor. She thought about the path that had brought her here, about the version of herself who once believed endurance meant silence. She understood now that endurance could also mean precision, knowing when to speak, how to speak, and accepting what followed. War had taught her many brutal lessons. This one felt quieter, but no less hard. One, she did not imagine she had changed the Navy. Institutions were vast, resistant things, but she had shifted a moment, and moments accumulated. Somewhere, a young service member would hesitate before turning experience into entertainment. Somewhere else, a leader would think twice before measuring worth in numbers. Those were not victories that came with medals. They were subtler, more durable. As months passed, the story of that lunch faded into rumor, then into myth. then into a single line repeated out of context. She let it go. What mattered had already taken root beyond her control. She returned her focus to the work, to preparation, to responsibility carried forward without spectacle. The faces she remembered remained with her, not as burdens, but as anchors reminding her why truth mattered. On a quiet evening, watching the horizon darken once more, she felt something like peace, not the absence of weight, but the balance of it. She had answered honestly, and the world had not ended. Authority had been challenged and survived. Dignity had held, that was enough. The joke would be forgotten. The answer would endure, reshaped and retold, stripped down to its core. Not a number, not a boast, a reminder that some lives were counted not by those lost, but by those protected. And in that truth, spoken once and carried many times after, her legacy would remain quiet, unyielding, and impossible to reduce to laughter.